The first postulate was the harmony of morality and objective nature, the final purpose of the world. The other, the harmony of morality and the sensuous will, the final purpose of self-consciousness as such. The first, then, is harmony in the form of an implicit being, the other in the form of being for self. But what connects, as middle terms, these postulated two extreme final purposes is the movement of actual conduct itself. They are harmonies whose movements and their abstract distinctiveness have not yet developed into objects for consciousness. This occurs in the actuality in which the sides appear in consciousness proper, each as the other of the other. The postulates arising from this now contain the harmonies both in and for themselves, whereas previously they were postulated only as separate, one being in itself or implicit, and the other being for itself or explicit. Paragraph 604 is considerably shorter than the two paragraphs preceding it, one of which goes on for almost 2 pages. And there's a lot going on in those paragraphs, but there's also a lot going on in this paragraph once we scratch the surface, because what Hegel is doing is now he's laid out these two different postulates that are governing moral consciousness and its action, and the relationship between duty or morality on the one side and something else presented as its other, also presented as something that is a sort of freedom, which we subsume under this term nature, but also include in terms of happiness, Glück, or Glücklichkeit, right? And also in terms of the will in the sense of a natural will, which has fundamental desires or drives, Treiben, right? And certain inclinations, Neigungen. So how is Hegel bringing this stuff together here? You notice that he's going to talk about a first postulate and a second postulate, and now he's making things very clear for us in a rather schematic way. So he reminds us the first postulate was what? The harmony of morality. And notice what he says here. He doesn't just say morality and nature. He says morality and objective nature. Gegenständlichkeit. Nature had become an object for the moral consciousness, not just sort of an inchoate ground, something that isn't known. And this really does reflect a nature understood, I would say, in a very modern sense, as a field of essentially mechanistic processes, or at least law-governed processes. So he does have in mind something like Kant's notion of nature, or the Newtonian, or many other modern philosophers' conception of nature as well. And this harmony is very important. And why is it a postulate? Let's remind ourselves of that. Because it doesn't actually exist yet. It's not there in nature. It's not there in the totality of moral consciousness or morality and nature put together. It has not yet been achieved. It's not yet been made actual. And Hegel will talk about this as a final purpose, an Endzweck in German. And that strikes us as a little bit funny in English, right? Because end is a translation of Zweck. So in a way it's saying an end, a final end. The end which motivates the other ends, which is sort of functioning like an attractor to them, you could think of it that way. Or as something that is leading them to their final state where they're most fully developed. A world that is most fully developed would in fact be a world in which morality and nature were in harmony. Now, as we've seen, of course, in the last paragraph, if we were to attain a state where there was a complete identification or coincidence between morality and nature, then we would lose the moral consciousness. A harmony doesn't necessarily have to be an identity Think of a harmony of notes, right? The first is not the third, is not the fifth, but together they comprise a harmony that we call a major chord. So, on the one side, we have this first postulate, harmony of morality and objective nature, the final purpose, as Hegel tells us here, of the world, of the totality of things that environ us, which includes us as things within the world. He says the second postulate, is the harmony of what? Morality and the sensuous, sinnliche, will. The will, insofar as it is not pure will, sort of an abstract conception, or something that's also within us in a, Kant would say, noumenal as opposed to phenomenal fashion, which means we can never really wrap our heads around it, let alone our fingers. And yet it's there, according to Kant, and in essence, according to Hegel, too. Even if it's not being made actual, it's still there in potentia, in latency, you might say. But the sensuous will is one that we're very familiar with. When we examine ourselves, what it is that we do in fact desire, like right now I desire to shoot a video on Hegel, right? I also desire to have a bit more coffee. I also desire to do all sorts of other things. Those are all part of my sensuous, we could say, world-bound will. And these are connected with each other. The will is, in part, how we, as individuals, as human beings, interface with reality. It's not just through our intellects, it's not just through our senses, it is through our desiring, our striving, our choosing, our preferring, our dispreferring. All of those things are ways in which we are involved with a world. So this is something worth keeping in your back pocket and thinking about later on. Now, Hegel goes on, and he tells us not only do we have this postulated harmony between the morality and the sensuous will, where a will could in fact be brought in line and have the right kind of inclinations, not go against morality all the time, the way that we find ourselves doing. He calls this the Endzweck, the final purpose of self-consciousness as such. So now we have two final purposes, and we have two postulates, we have two harmonies. How does this hold together? So he goes on and he says we have a middle term. Let's look at the text itself. What connects as a middle term these postulated two extreme final purposes is what? The movement, he says, of actual conduct itself. Isn't that an interesting thing to say? The movement, the Bewegung of actual conduct, wirklichen Handelns, what it is that we actually do. Not just what we will, not just what we think, not just what we know, what we in fact do. What it is that we choose, what it is that we prioritize, how far we see it through. That is the vital connection that binds these two postulates together and offers them any possibility of being actualized as such. So the possibility of morality and the world of nature being harmonized, the possibility of morality and this crazy will that we have as individuals being harmonized lies in action, lies in conduct, in doing something. So he says, these are harmonies whose moments, in their abstract distinctiveness, have not yet developed into objects for consciousness. Where does this occur? Hegel tells us this occurs in the actuality in which the sides appear in consciousness proper, each as the other of the other. So each of these is, you might say, a piece or a object of our consciousness. We're lending them space in our heads, And each of them is taking on a certain kind of subjectivity. Each can be an other to the other. Each of them is taking on a certain kind of agency. They're becoming something like a drive. So he says, the postulates arising from this now. So we have a new set of postulates, right? What are these postulates? These postulates now transformed through action into having a genuine other in our moral consciousness. The postulates arising from this now contain the harmonies both in and for themselves, he says. Whereas previously they were postulated only as separate, one being in itself or implicit, the one over here, and the one being for itself or explicit. Now, why does he say implicit and explicit? Well, is this typical Hegel playing around with the categories of in itself, for itself, in and for itself, the third term here? No, there's something more to it. What do we experience more directly? The lack of harmony of morality with the world environing us, or the interior conflicts that we ourselves have in trying to fulfill the moral law and finding ourselves being driven all sorts of other places by the actual will, the dispositions, the inclinations, the drives, the desires that we do in fact have, and then having to push against it. That's much more explicit. That is for itself. This is in itself. It has to be called out, but it doesn't take too much to do that. And to bring this to a close, the vital connection in not between them as in itself, but making them in and for itself is going to be some sort of conduct or action. The moral consciousness as the simple knowing and willing of pure duty is, in the doing of it, brought into relation with the object which stands in contrast to its simplicity, into relation with the actuality of the complex case, and thereby has a complex moral relationship with it. Here arise in relation to content the many laws generally, and in relation to form the contradictory powers of the knowing consciousness and of the non-conscious. In the first place, as regards the many duties, the moral consciousness in general heeds only the pure duty in them. The many duties qua manifold are specific, and therefore as such have nothing sacred about them for the moral consciousness. At the same time, however, being necessary, since the notion of doing implies a complex actuality, and therefore a complex moral relation to it, these many duties must be regarded as possessing an intrinsic being of their own. Further, since they can exist only in a moral consciousness, they exist at the same time in another consciousness than that for which only pure duty qua pure duty possesses an intrinsic being of its own and is sacred. Paragraph 605 is another short paragraph in comparison to 602 and 603. There's some important stuff going on here, and it's a bit of a jump from the previous paragraph into this one. We're going to see all of these threads being brought back together shortly, but not in paragraph 605. So what is Hegel discussing here? We start out by talking about the moral consciousness again, and he says the moral consciousness can be understood, as we have previously, as the simple knowing, wissen, and simple willing, wollen, of pure duty. And where did we get this simple willing and knowing from? All the way back in the absolute freedom and the terror section. That was the culmination. Consciousness in the transition to moral consciousness was realizing itself as pure knowing and pure willing, and somehow there being, you might say, not a pure coincidence of these, but them being integrated with each other. So, where do we go from there? He says, in its doing, and we saw that doing, or handeln, was this third integrating term in the previous paragraph. Here Hegel's not talking about that, but he is referring us back by using the same term. In this doing of pure duty, it's brought into relation, Verhältnis, with the object. Now here's where it starts to get very interesting, which stands in contrast to its simplicity, its Einfachheit, its one-sidedness. It's not actually one-sidedness as such, it would be Einseitigkeit, but having one aspect to it, having one way of being. What is opposed to that? Duplicity? Actually, that's going to come up as a section later on. No, not duplicity, multiplicity, Mannigfaltigkeit, or in its adjective form here, Mannigfaltigen. Having many different aspects, having many different relations, many sides, not all being able to be grasped at once. If something is einfach, simple, you can grasp it as a totality at once. If something is complex or many-sided, or we might even say ambiguous, then it can't all be grasped at once, and you struggle to put it all together. So the object of duty in action, when we start trying to actually do our duty in the real world or on ourselves, to go back to the previous paragraph, when we're trying to bring about some sort of harmonization between morality and the world, or when we're trying to bring about some sort of harmonization or successful integration between morality and its demands and our screwed up wills that we have to use to get themselves in line with morality, whenever we're doing that, we are engaging in action in cases. We don't just do it in general. We do it in this case, in this case, in this case in our lives. This is something that Aristotle had pointed out way back in ancient Greece. We can certainly generalize about moral phenomena. We can come up with rules. They only hold for the most part. Why? Well, because they have to apply to specifics. They have to apply to individuals, to particulars. And when we get to the level of complex cases, our nice, clean, neat rules, our duties in this case, our Pflichte, right, don't always hold so nicely their shape, we could say, their neat contours. So let's go on with this. He says, it stands in relation and in contrast with the actuality of the complex case. So the actuality, the Wirklichkeit, the being real, the stuff we encounter, of the complex, mannigfaltigen case, fall. There's kind of a play on words there, mannigfaltigen fall, right? What it is that we're actually encountering. So if I may have a general duty not to lie, and then I'm encountering one of those tricky situations, let's take a sort of hypothetical thought experiment first, right? What if there's a crazy murderer and he is asking where the babies are so he can go in and kill all of them? Do you tell the murderer, who you can't actually stop by your own means, where the babies are? Or do you lie to him and tell him that the babies are on the other side of town? It can get much more concrete than that. That's still a rather abstract, nice, simple thought experiment. What if it's somebody who you actually know, and they want to use some drugs, and they know that they're in the house somewhere, and they're an addict, and you've been through this many times with them, and they say really they just need to even themselves out because they're really jonesing for it. And, they also have to hold down a job, and they need to function. And maybe just this one time you could let them have it, but just a small amount to tide them over. But then that might lead to them, continuing on, and see how it gets very complicated very quickly. So this is an important point, isn't it? That morality is not quite so simple to impose upon ourselves or the world through knowing and willing as we would like to think. So he says, in relation to content, the stuff, the many laws generally, and in relation to form, the contradictory powers of the knowing consciousness and of the non-conscious. This is how they arise. So in content, we have, like he says, all these different laws, all these different obligations, all these different duties that we're faced with. And in relation to form, there's something unconscious, unbewusst, going on here. He doesn't actually follow up too much on that at this point, but that's worth pointing out. So now he goes on and he says, in the first place, as regards the many duties, what does the moral consciousness pay attention to? The moral consciousness in general heeds only the pure duty in them. So it tries to see within each of these specific duties that has to do with a specific case, a real life situation. It reads the general simple duty into it. And that can be sometimes quite successful and sometimes can be markedly unsuccessful or even paradoxical or can cause all sorts of other problems. Now, Hegel goes on and he says these many duties, as many or as manifold, as different from each other, are specific, and therefore as such have nothing sacred, nothing holy, nothing absolutely morally compelling about them for the moral consciousness, the way that this simple notion of willing and knowing duty does. But, he says, at the same time, being necessary, these duties are still duties, so they are necessary in some sense, since the notion of doing implies a complex actuality and therefore a complex moral relationship to it. These many duties must be regarded as possessing an intrinsic being of their own. So we've already got a problem here. We're going to have a second problem coming up very quickly, but let's point out this problem. We have this nice, neat conception of duty that's very simple. We can wrap our heads around it. I mean, think about Kant's categorical imperative. Sounds great. Act only on the maxim that you can at the same time will to be a universal law of nature. Boom, there it is. Or act always so as to treat humanity and your own person and that of others never as a mere means, but always as an end. Great. It's very abstract. What happens when we get down to the nitty-gritty of particular cases? And we do start doing applied ethics, right? We start thinking as nurses or engineers or media consultants or friends and neighbors or parents or children, or we could go on and on and on. It starts to get very murky, and that's when we have a tendency to start saying, well, I don't know how I fit it under this rubric of general duty, but I know I have a duty to do this. And there's a tendency to start saying, well, maybe we get rid of the general concept and we just enumerate our duties. This is, by the way, is what professional codes of ethics typically do, right? They'll have a few general principles, and you ask any of the practitioners, what do those general principles mean? And they're like, humana, I don't know, don't ask me what fidelity actually means or non-maleficence actually means. But then you get down to specific things. Okay, if a child is showing signs of sexual trauma, you need to report it to these authorities. I'm thinking about, like a psychiatric or psychological association or medical association, or really, they'd be bound on teachers or police or whoever. Then you have to report it. That's a specific duty. Now the question then is, how do we bring these together successfully? The very general, abstract, simple duty and the real life duties that we in fact encounter, face, feel ourselves bound by. It's not resolved here, but that's being raised. Second issue comes up in the last sentence. Further, these specific duties, since they can exist only in a moral consciousness, that's something worth pointing out. There's no such thing as a duty that's out there like in the world by itself without being in any sort of moral consciousness. At the very least, if it's in a book and we all have died off and somebody else is reading the book, they're encountering moral consciousness through that book, right? They exist at the same time in another moral consciousness, right? And what moral consciousness do they exist in? They exist in another consciousness than that for which only pure duty, qua pure duty, possesses an intrinsic being of its own and is sacred. So we have a split within moral consciousness taking place. We have a self and other dynamic starting to occur, and now we have to see where that goes.